Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Walker Smith, and I will be presenting today's webinar along with my colleague, Mary Cannon. Mary, would you like to jump in and welcome our group?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Hello, I can hear you, Mary.
Very good.
All right, so hopefully everyone can hear. If you can't hear us, please let us know via the chat box, and so that way we can attempt to make some adjustments. But certainly want to welcome you all to our webinar. As promised, it starts at 1:30, and so I certainly want to be sensitive for folks' time. I work at Baldwin Wallace University, and Mary is at Hondros College of Nursing, and you see our email addresses on the screen in front of you, so please feel free to use either of us as a resource. And so with that, we're going to get right into the presentation. So today's webinar is going to be really just an introduction to financial aid. And so we're going to give you a broad overview of the financial aid process. For those of you who think you might want a more in-depth presentation and discussion, you are encouraged to attend any of the upcoming OASFA counselor workshops. And on the screen in front of you, you should see the dates of those workshops. And so if you have an interest in attending those, I've heard anecdotally that they provide a great depth of information. You can very easily register by going to the OASFA website and then clicking on the link there for the high school counselor registration. And so I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already done so. This webinar is sponsored by OASFA. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, the OASFA acronym actually stands for the Ohio Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And so know that the material we have compiled for you today comes from OASFA as well as the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or more commonly known as NASFA, as well as Federal Student Aid, which is known as FSA. A little bit more information about OASFA. It is a nonprofit organization that is comprised of volunteer financial aid professionals. Today's information is provided to you free, and you are allowed to copy and distribute this information to students and families. This is a good place to note that the PowerPoint slides will be posted to the OASFA website as soon as possible after the webinar ends. And so know that we will make these slides available for you to copy and distribute as you see fit. Know that if you do choose to disseminate this information, that you should not charge folks to get it from you, and that if you want to use it for any other purposes, you do need to get permission from OASFA. If you'd like to contact any of the leadership for the outreach committee, you can do so by going to the OASFA website and looking up the chairpersons and contacting them through that information, or you can send an email to the outreach committee through the OASFA email address that you see listed there, outreach@oasfa.org. Last but not least, want to put in another plug for OASFA and let you know, for those who aren't aware, that there are some additional resources for counselors that are available for download at the OASFA website, and it's listed there in the orange link. And so I had a chance to check it out, and there's information for counselors, information for financial aid folks, but certainly a wealth of information. I do believe the PowerPoint that we're going to provide is going to be underneath this documentation as well. And so again, I'm going to make arrangements to get this information sent over to OASFA so it can be posted as soon as possible after the webinar. Given that, before I jump into the topic, the other announcement I want to make is that given that this is a broad overview and we only have 1 hour, for the most part, I'm going to go through the slides, but certainly don't let that stop you from asking questions. We ask that you use the chat feature if you would like to ask a question. I, Erica, am going to be doing the speaking for today, and my colleague Mary, she is the one who is going to handle the questions that come in through the chat box. And so that's how we're going to tag team today. And then just real quickly before I dive right in, I created a short poll. I'm going to see if I can get it to work. I may or may not, where I just wanted to ask you guys one question to kind of get a feel for the audience. And so I'm going to launch that. And if you could take a moment to answer that, it just gives me a little bit of information with respect to my audience. Thank you so much for answering. Looks like most of you have responded, and so looks like a large portion of the group are folks who've been in their position less than a year. Of course, we don't know each other's positions, but even still, I hope this presentation, you will find it useful, and it'll give you some information that certainly you can use in that role and help you be even more effective than you already are in it. And so with that, I'm going to jump right in. And so when thinking about financial aid, one of the major keys is understanding how this system works. And so in our webinar today, we're pretty much going to navigate all three of those parts. The first part will focus on process and programs, and so there'll be some kind of foundational information, if you will. The second part, we're going to talk about filling out the FAFSA and also talk about filing that. And then the third part, we're going to kind of wrap things up and bring it all back together, talk a little bit about financial aid awards and things of that nature. But this is pretty much the financial aid process in 3 steps. So you got the process and programs, the FAFSA, and then the output out of all of that is typically the financial aid awards and award letters. Here's a couple of resources that we have found to be extremely helpful. And so again, the OASFA website, and so that's the web address that was listed in a couple slides previously, has a good number of tools that you can download and use hopefully in your day-to-day responsibilities. And then Federal Student Aid is a great resource to get publications. Right here, I want to put a plug in for something called the FAFSA on the Web worksheet. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail later on in the webinar, but typically you find that FAFSA on the Web worksheet here at that FSA Pubs website. And so myself and Mary actually took a look on the site this week, and we have not yet seen it for 18-19, but typically it should be forthcoming, especially given that the FAFSA is going to be available for the 18-19 year in just a few days. And so definitely we encourage you guys to utilize that tool, and FSA Pubs is where you should go to check as to when that will be available for you and your students. And so with respect to financial aid, there's pretty much 4 main types of financial aid, and they fall into about 2 categories. And so with respect to gift assistance, and gift assistance are financial aid resources that don't have to be paid back. And so those are things like scholarships and grants. And then you have the self-help aid category, and this is where your loans, and so the student loans as well as the parent loans will fall in this category, as well as employment opportunities. In terms of some more categories of aid, if you will, there's merit-based, and so these typically consist of your scholarships that will require some sort of a performance criteria. So whether that is a specific academic performance or some sort of athletic talent, but there's usually some kind of demonstration of a student's performance that they have to demonstrate before they can get those items. And they're based on just that merit, so whether it's academic merit, athletic merit, or maybe even some unique talent. Second category is need-based financial aid, and this would include things such as your grants. There are loans that are need-based. There's also federal work study, which is need-based, and so that's where the students work the job on the campus, and they get to earn money that they can apply to their charges there, or potentially put that money in their pocket to use to take care of miscellaneous expenses. The need-based loan option from the federal government is the subsidized loan. And so students who have demonstrated financial need through the FAFSA, they will then be granted a subsidized loan. And then in terms of grants, these could be federal grants, so things like Pell Grants, Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants. They could also be state-based grants, so like the Ohio College Opportunity Grant. They can also be institutional grants, and so your school may have a financial aid resource that's based on need that they give the students. And then there are things that are available that are not based on need, but are not merit-based, and so those items would be loans, and I'm thinking the unsubsidized loan goes here. Some students receive veterans benefits, and so that's what the VA benefits are. And then students also work jobs that are not federal work-study jobs, but they may still work on your institutions, and so even still, that is another source of aid. So kind of turning the corner, and talking about, we've identified the different types of aid and some categories. So now let's spend a little bit of time talking about the principle of need analysis. And basically, a basic definition of need analysis is the evaluation to determine what types of financial aid a student is eligible for. And so when you think about need analysis from a large picture, parents have the primary responsibility in paying for their dependent child's education to the extent that they are able. Also, students have a responsibility to contribute to their educational costs, and this is why the FAFSA collects the information from both the student and the parent. The second principle behind need analysis is that families should be evaluated in their present financial condition. And so that's why the FAFSA pretty much takes a snapshot. So whenever the families fill it out, whatever the date it is they're actually sitting down to do this FAFSA, that is the date at which they are providing their information. And so that's where that present financial condition comes from. Now know that there's been some recent FAFSA changes that may cause for financial aid administrators to utilize professional judgment, and I'll pick up on that and touch a little bit more about it when we come to the slide later on with respect to special circumstances. And then the third principle of need analysis is that a family's ability to pay for educational costs must be evaluated equitably and consistently. And that's why everybody fills out the FAFSA. So everybody's filling out the same form that's asking the same questions to try to do this in an equitable and consistent manner. Even still, financial aid administrators recognize that families will incur special circumstances, and those special circumstances could quite possibly affect a family's ability to pay, and that's why that mechanism exists for financial aid administrators to be able to make those types of changes on a case-by-case basis. And so one of the main players in terms of figuring out a family or a student's financial need is using this simple subtraction equation. And so how we define need, or kind of come to that financial need number, is you take the cost of attendance of a particular institution. And so that would include your direct charges as well as your indirect charges. And so you can see from the box there, things such as tuition, room, books and supplies, transportation. From that big number, that cost of attendance, we'll subtract out the expected family contribution. That's the number that is calculated whenever a student files a FAFSA form. And so that number will stay the same, and we'll get into a little bit more about the EFC momentarily. So when you take that EFC number from that larger cost of attendance, what's left over is the financial need. And so this is the number that colleges and universities are potentially trying to meet depending on their financial aid awarding policies. Some schools will meet all of a student's need. Some institutions might exceed that student's need, and other students may fall a little short of that need. But at the end of the day, this is that basic calculation of financial need. And so doing a little bit of a deeper dive into that expected family contribution, this number is calculated according to a formula established by law. And those are the laws that are connected to the Higher Education Act. And this EFC number is going to stay the same regardless of the college. And so it is not going to change. So when that family files that FAFSA, let's say for 18-19, their EFC is going to be the same no matter how many colleges they are looking to receive financial aid from. One important thing to note is that this formula does not measure a willingness to pay. And so just keep that in mind. The EFC is basically an index number which is used to determine need-based funding, if you will. And so think about that equation that we just went over, I think the last slide it was. And so the FAFSA, all the information that's presented on the FAFSA is what's used to calculate the EFC. And that's an important thing to understand, because in your work, if you are counseling students and families, you may hear folks say the EFC is too high or is not an indicative. And in some instances, that EFC number may not be accurate. And oftentimes it could be because of an inaccuracy that has been reported on the FAFSA. And so just keep that in mind. And then last but not least, the institution's cost of attendance is going to determine the total funding awarded. And so basically, we are, as financial aid administrators, we're not permitted to give a student more financial aid than what it costs to attend that institution. So for additional information about how the EFC is calculated, that website at the bottom is a fantastic resource. So studentaid.gov/howcalculated, for those of you who feel so compelled as to get more information about the calculation of the EFC. Another piece of the EFC that we felt it was important to just spend a little bit of time, not a whole lot at all, but we wanted to touch on the income protection allowance. And this is helpful because, again, I at least in my tenure, and I've been in the financial aid arena for 7 years, but I've been in higher education for a total of 16 years. I've heard a number of families voice concerns that the information they report on the FAFSA will be interpreted in such a way that it'll look as though they have a whole bunch of money to provide for college expenses. And so basically know that a portion of that EFC calculation contains something that's called an income protection allowance. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, basically the income protection allowance is income that is considered unavailable. And so know that when a student's EFC is calculated, a portion of that is the portion of the income they're reporting is going to be considered unavailable because it's built into the system that way. And that's because this income protection allowance accounts for basic household living expenses, and it's going to assume a low-level cost of living. And so it's not going to take into account any exorbitant spending, but there is the understanding from the federal government, particularly when it comes to parents of dependent students, that these folks have to run a household, and there are going to be expenses associated with that. And so there's going to be a part of their income that is going to be protected or unavailable. And so there's income protection allowances within this EFC formula for both the dependent students as well as the parents. And so for the parents of the dependent students, the amount of income that is protected is going to be based on the number of persons that live in the household, as well as the number of persons who are enrolled in college. And so both of those things. And so if you go to the 2018-19 EFC formula, there is a table A3, and that's where you can actually find that amount. And finding the EFC formula is really easy. Simply Google 2018-19 EFC formula, and you'll get a number of options that'll come up. But so that table, and you guys can see that at a later time at your convenience, is table A3. And then for dependent students, because their parents are providing for them as a member of the household, their income protection allowance is a fixed amount. And for the 18-19 FAFSA formula, that amount has been fixed at $6,570. And so if you have a student who earns less than that, good news for them is all of that income is going to be protected. If you have a student who may work an awful lot and earn more than that, then what this says is that $6,570, or whatever their earnings are over that amount, that's what's going to be protected, and it's going to be considered as unavailable to pay for college expenses. And so just to show you, just to give this slide here just gives a graphical representation, so you can see how as the cost of attendance would shift between institutions, then that will affect the need. And whereas the EFC is always going to remain the same. Right here is where we'd like to throw in a plug for those of you working with students and families, and some of which may be more anxious than others to kind of get an idea about how much can we expect to receive. The net price calculator is a great tool for students and families to use as they navigate the college acceptance and admissions process to kind of get a feel for what might a financial aid award look like. I do believe that all colleges and universities are required to have a net price calculator. And so certainly, please don't be shy in driving your students and families to use those tools. Again, it's a good way to estimate what they could potentially receive in a financial aid award. The one caveat I will say is that the estimate is only going to be as accurate as the information that's put into it. And so I always make sure that I let students and families know that as well. And so if a family underestimates their FAFSA information in the net price calculator, they may very well get a financial aid award that's overstated, and the opposite may occur as well. If a student I don't know if I said over or under, but basically either way it's going to be the opposite, and so the information is only going to be as good as the information that's put in. But certainly, please encourage your folks to use that. It's another good tool. And so kind of shifting gears and moving into the FAFSA process for the 2018-19 year, know that the FAFSA is now available October 1st. And so that is just in a matter of days. The 18-19 FAFSA will be available. This FAFSA is going to utilize prior year tax information, which is also known by the PPY acronym, if you will. And so this will be the second year now that the FAFSA is using data that's going to be reported from 2 years prior. So for any students filing 18-19 FAFSAs, the 2016 tax information is going to be required. So I just want to pause right here. Mary, do we have any, I want to check in with Mary to see if we have any questions from our participants.
We don't have any questions yet.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I will keep it moving then. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
So with respect to FAFSA, there's oftentimes some questions in terms of deadlines. In previous years, there was the concern that the FAFSA deadline was coming up before folks could get their tax information together. And so if you find that you have a student that is dealing with some sort of an early deadline, how might you advise them? Well, the first thing we recommend is that you tell them to follow the FAFSA directions. And so that's first and foremost. Also, we encourage all of our students and families to use that IRS data retrieval tool. And that was one of the reasons why the change was made to the FAFSA to use information from the prior year, because the thought process was, if we're using data from 2 years ago, folks who are required to file income tax returns should have very well completed those by the time they're filing the particular FAFSA. And so the goal was that it would enable more students to be able to use this IRS data retrieval tool if they're using income from 2 years prior. And that would also give students the ability to meet those early deadlines without estimating their data. And so that's pretty much the federal government's mindset around why they decided to push the income information back to 2 years. And so some folks may wonder, what are Ohio colleges and universities doing about these deadlines? Note that we have a handy resource. It's called the FAFSA Priority Deadline Survey. And that is posted at that wonderful OASPA website that you've seen probably about twice now, under the resources section for counselors. And so if you ever have a question as to what is a school's FAFSA priority deadline, the outreach committee worked very hard trying to reach out to all the colleges in Ohio and find out what that deadline, if they have one, was going to be for the 18-19 year. And so I encourage you to get out there to the OASPA website underneath the resources section, and then go to the area for counselors, where you'll find the 2018-19 FAFSA Priority Deadline Survey. Just note that there may be other deadlines, so other institutional deadlines, and in some instances state deadlines that students may need to adhere to. In terms of scholarship searches and scams, certainly it is a time where buyers must beware, so continue to educate your students and your families that they really should not be paying a fee to apply for a scholarship. That is a humongous red flag. And so typically legitimate scholarships are not going to charge anything. And so just continue to encourage folks to be mindful of that. Also, there's a resource there, Project Scholarship Scam, where you can get some additional information on how to help your students and their families avoid finding themselves in that type of a situation. We certainly encourage students to pursue local scholarships, and the reasoning behind that is those typically there's less competition, and so when it comes down to getting awarded them, students generally have a better shot because there are fewer applicants when they're looking at the local scholarships. But the flip side of that is they typically tend to be smaller in terms of the amounts. And so when you put it up next to a national scholarship, the local scholarships typically tend to be pretty small. But what I always have told students is that those little scholarships add up. So yeah, one might be 500, another one might be 750, and another one might be 1,000. But if you get all three of those, that's already $2,250. And so they do add up. We encourage folks to look for these local scholarships, which are also known as outside scholarships, from a number of different organizations. And so check out the civic organizations in their communities, the churches, the employers, even the financial institutions. I've seen banks and credit unions offer scholarships to students. And so advise your students and families to not leave any stone unturned, particularly in their local communities. Also, another source for scholarships would be to check with the colleges and universities to whom a student is applying, as they may be aware of external scholarships, and in some instances there may even be some institutional scholarships that they can help point students and families in the right direction of potentially receiving. This screen right here just gives a brief listing of the different financial aid programs in Ohio. These are the programs that are available for the current year. And so some of these names may be more familiar than others. But certainly these are all that are awarded by the state of Ohio. The Ohio College Opportunity Grant is the one that we're going to highlight in this presentation. And so this resource comes out of the Ohio Department of Education. Know that this was formerly known as the Ohio Board of Regents, and the eligibility criteria for a student to receive an Ohio College Opportunity Grant is listed there on the screen. And so basically the student has to file the FAFSA by the indicated deadline, and know that on the front page of the FAFSA there is a chart that lists the deadlines for all of the different states. And for Ohio, that date is October 1st, and that's October 1st of the subsequent year. And so hopefully I can explain this a little bit more eloquently using an example. So for students who will be filling out a 18-19 FAFSA, and they are expecting to enroll in the fall of 2018, that FAFSA has to be filed prior to October 1st of 2018. So that first year of enrollment, in order for them to be considered for an Ohio College Opportunity Grant if they meet the rest of the criteria. So students have to be an Ohio resident. They need to attend an eligible Ohio or Pennsylvania institution. They also have to have an EFC, expected family contribution, that is less than or equal to 2,190, and they have to have a maximum household income of no more than $96,000. And so if a student meets all of that criteria, then more likely than not, they will be awarded a Ohio College Opportunity Grant. It does have limitations in terms of how long a student can receive this type of assistance. And so the maximum is 10 semesters or 15 quarters of enrollment. This slide gives a screenshot of the chart that's available on the OCOG website. So if you go to www.ohiohighered.org/OCOG, you will see this lovely chart. And so know that it's broken down very nicely into a public section, a private section, and even a Pennsylvania section. Know that students who attend community colleges and regional campuses are eligible to receive OCOG if they are eligible for the Education and Voucher Training Program, or ETV. I think I have my description of that on my notes section a little twisted around, but do know that students who who qualify for ETV are eligible to receive OCOG. I want to point your attention in particular to the different asterisks that are in the chart. And so you'll see some line items have 1 asterisk, others will have 2, and then the one there at Pennsylvania will have 3. And so I just want to give a brief explanation of those asterisks. Again, the information I'm going to explain is available on the highered.org, ohiohighered.org/OASFA website, because I took it exactly from there. And so just know that with respect to the community college and the regional campuses, that typically there are no OCOG awards made to students at these institutions because the tuition is so low that the Pell Grant typically covers the majority, if not all, of students' expenses. But students can potentially receive OCOG if they're attending a community college or a regional campus if they are enrolled year-round and they exhaust all of their Pell Grant. And so there is the opportunity. And so just want to point that out for those of you who may work at those institutions or have a number of students that look at them. And so it doesn't mean that they automatically won't get anything. There is an opportunity. And so for further guidance, I want to defer you to the Ohio Department of Higher Ed. For the line items that have the 2 asterisks. Just the asterisk is there to make notation that this is a maximum award that a student could potentially receive if they are attending those institutions. But it does not mean they will automatically receive that. But that is the top amount. And so those institutions, both the private, nonprofit, and for-profit, should give consideration for the students who meet the rest of that other criteria that we have discussed earlier. And then last but not least, for students who attend eligible Pennsylvania institutions, and for more information about those institutions, you'd want to certainly contact the Ohio Department of Education. Students are eligible to receive Ohio College Opportunity Grant funds. As you can see, it's a little bit smaller than if they were to keep those dollars in Ohio. So just wanted to point those things out to you. So let's talk a little bit about federal work study. Federal work study is considered a campus-based program. And so what that means is there is a priority deadline attached to that. And for those of you who want to get more information about campus-based programs, you can certainly get that from NASFA. That's where I received some information at. But federal work study, there are undergraduate and graduate students who can be eligible to receive it. Employment can be either on or off campus. And the good thing about federal work study from a FAFSA filing perspective is that any federal work study wages are excluded from the EFC calculation. And so that's why the FAFSA asks about federal work study earnings. And so if you work with students who have work study positions, tell them, to make sure that they report that information on the FAFSA. There are a number of different eligible employers at which students can perform federal work study positions. There could be the school, they could do federal work study positions at a federal, state, or local public agency. They can also perform work study at private nonprofit organizations, as well as for-profit organizations. And then there's even some community service activities that could potentially qualify for federal work study. Here in Ohio, the minimum wage for 2017 is $8.15 per hour, and that is typically the going rate for a federal work study position, so in terms of rate of pay. So at this point, I'm going to pause again and ask Mary if we've had any questions in our chat room.
Erica, we have not had any questions.
All right, well, I will keep it rolling. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you.
All right, so just talking a little bit more about some of the resources. This slide talks briefly about Pell and Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grants, which is known as SEOG. And so for 17-18, the maximum Pell Grant that a student could receive is $5,920, and that's with an EFC of 0. So students at the lowest EFC level can get the highest amount of Pell. And then conversely, the highest EFC that a student could have and still qualify to get Pell would be 5,328. And for students at that level, the Pell Grant amount is $606. And so basically, the higher a student's EFC is, the lower the amount of Pell. And I just need to point out that that should say $606 maximum Pell. It should not say minimum, and so I do apologize for that. With respect to the federal SEOG grant, this is another campus-based program, and this grant is awarded to students who have exceptional financial need, and it's typically the students with the lowest EFCs. And so when consideration is being given for this group of funds, Pell eligible students are the priority. And these awards can range anywhere from $100 to $4,000 over the course of an academic year. Federal Perkins Loan. Federal Perkins Loan was given a 2-year extension. But it was extended with the agreement that no new loans are going to be originated after September 30th, 2017. And so for those of you who work at institutions that have distributed Pell Grants, I do believe this is going to be the last year for that program. I know I haven't heard anything about the program being extended. So just want to put that in there, that the Perkins program, it looks like it's going to come to an end. And so there are going to be no new awards for that. For folks who had previously received Pell Grants, the terms of eligibility was that the student had to have a FAFSA on file, they needed to be an undergraduate student and have some sort of need that wasn't being unmet. It had an interest rate that had 5% during repayment, and the interest on Perkins loans are subsidized during school, and then it's a 9-month grace period after the students graduate. And it also has some deferment and some cancellation provisions. And so moving forward, you're probably not going to see any Perkins loans after this 17-18 year. I know at my institution we are awarding them to freshmen, but we are notifying them that this will be the last year, and so they should not expect that as a resource in the future. And so just want to put that plug out there that that program is scheduled to come to an end after September 30th of this year. Just want to pause real quickly. Mary, would you like to add anything that you may know about the Federal Perkins Loan Program?
There's not much more, Erica, to say than what you've already said. I know that there is some lawmakers that are trying to continue the program, trying to drag it out. I don't see that happening. Erica, would you agree with that?
I agree totally. I don't see it happening either. I haven't heard anything, and so it's probably going to come to an end, folks. So
yeah, I would agree.
All right, so with that, we'll just keep on plugging away. So last but not least, I just want to touch a little bit on student loans and just reiterate that there's actually that website that you see there, Consumer Finance. That's a really cool resource. And so this is one resource if you or your students are looking to learn a little bit more about loans. I wasn't really familiar with it, and so I decided to check it out. And this is a really good resource. It comes from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and this is just one more resource that's out there for us to help our students and our families make informed financial decisions around going to college. And so this website provides a couple guides for student loans and student banking. It also has a tool that can be used to help families compare financial aid awards. And last but not least, there's some information about repaying student debt. Again, with loans, there are some differences between federal versus private education loans, and so we just encourage students and families to find out what the similarities as well as the differences are when they're making these type of decisions. Certainly, it's been an ongoing theme to encourage folks to borrow only what they need and to look at loans as an investment in their future. How does one apply for a federal direct loan? The FAFSA is the application process. So they have to file their FAFSA, and they have to file that FAFSA before the end of the enrollment period. And so to give an example, for the 2018-19 academic year, a student has up until June 30th of 2018 to file a FAFSA. We don't recommend that folks wait that late, but just know that they have up until that date to file a FAFSA. To find out more effort students should also review the financial aid award letters from their schools, because typically in that aid award, that's going to indicate what their eligibility amounts are for student loans. And then students can always go to studentloans.gov and sign in here to do a couple of things. There's the entrance counseling requirement and the master promissory note requirement. So for any student who's looking to utilize federal loans that they have been offered, they have to do those two things, and they have to be done online through the studentloans.gov website. Also, if there are parents who are going to borrow the PLUS loan to help cover their dependent students' expenses, they too will need to go online at studentloans.gov to complete that PLUS loan application and also to sign that MPN. And so it's important for students to have that FSA ID, which we're going to talk about momentarily. So basically, for the first-time filers, they need to certainly apply for admission. That kind of gets the ball rolling. So for all of those schools, they need to submit those applications, and they need to complete that process, so whatever it entails. Also, when they get ready to file the FAFSA, again, that FAFSA on the web worksheet is going to be a great tool. And so if you have folks who are really apprehensive because they've never filed a FAFSA before, that FAFSA on the web worksheet is an awesome tool. I've given it out at a number of high school financial aid nights and encouraged folks to use it because it follows the order of the FAFSA. Folks should certainly do the worksheet first, then complete that FAFSA form, and again, know that it'll be available starting October 1st for the 2018-19 year. With respect to special circumstances, because as we mentioned earlier, the FAFSA is going to be using information from 2 years ago, there may be some instances in which families will need to report a special circumstance. And so just understand that when these requests are evaluated, and they have to be evaluated at each individual school, you can't just fill out one special circumstance request and think that all schools are going to get it. It has to be done at each institution. Know that the financial aid administrators, number one, they must have a compelling reason to be able to use their professional judgment that will allow them to make adjustments to the information on the FAFSA. And then two, these decisions as to whether or not a special circumstance request is approved are final and can't be appealed. And so once the financial aid administrator makes the decision on the request as to whether or not the situation is a special circumstance and thereby warrants FAFSA adjustments, there is no federal government that unhappy folks can appeal to. For 18-19, we expect to see a significant number of requests for special circumstances. And again, that's because this FAFSA is pulling information that's 2 years old. And so for some families, that may not be an accurate representation of what's happening today in their household. And so if you are working with the student and their household is experiencing some sort of change to their financial situation that's not captured in the information that the FAFSA is asking for, we encourage you to counsel the student or family to complete the FAFSA to the extent they are able and submit it as instructed. And then what they will want to do is follow up with the financial aid office at each college to find more about that individual school's special circumstance process. In the box there, you see these are probably some of the more common financial aid, not financial aid, special circumstance reasons. So when people submit these requests, a lot of times we see these items here in the green box. Verification is a process that some folks may be selected for as a result of filing the FAFSA. And so this is the process by which schools are asked to collect additional documentation from students so that they can pretty much verify the information that's been put on the FAFSA. If students are selected and they don't provide the documents needed so that the verification can be completed, know that those students will not receive federal student aid, and they may not receive aid from other non-federal sources. And so it's very important, if you have students who get selected, to tell them to complete the process. And so this is kind of this graphic here just kind of represents a process flow, if you will. So the IRS data retrieval tool is used to help facilitate the FAFSA filing as well as the verification process, and both of those things ultimately enable the financial aid offices to produce a financial aid award. Kind of putting verification and IRS data retrieval side by side, some of the defining features of both. So the IRS data retrieval tool is intended to make FAFSA completion easier. And so again, it's a tool that should help make this process simpler. And what it basically does is it securely transfers tax information from the IRS to the FAFSA form. And so if folks can use this IRS data retrieval tool, it is really a time saver. Participation is voluntary, so know that folks don't have to use it, but I typically encourage students and families, if you're able, use it because it cuts down on the time spent filing the FAFSA. For folks who use this data retrieval tool, it's typically going to reduce the number of documents requested if that FAFSA is selected for verification, and so that's another benefit of this. With respect to the verification process, typically students are selected by either the federal government or a college or university may decide to select them for verification. If the FAFSA that's selected for verification hasn't used the IRS data retrieval tool, then tax return transcripts are going to need to be submitted. Also, to complete this verification process, if folks have not filed don't have to file taxes, they have to indicate that, and that's usually done by some sort of institutional form. Again, financial aid cannot be dispersed, and so no federal funds can be dispersed. And in many instances, I don't think institutional need-based aid will be dispersed either without the verification process being completed. And the big thing with verification is that the documentation, even though the federal government selects these FAFSAs, all of that required documentation must go to the financial aid office. Don't send it to the federal government. And so FAFSA, we encourage folks to file it on the web, and so that's what that acronym means, FOTW, FAFSA on the web. And the box there in the screen just lists some of the compelling reasons to file. Basically, it's quicker and it helps prevent a lot of errors because there are some edits that are built in. And so just to move forward, now we're going to go through some screenshots of what the FAFSA looks like. And so when you go to fill out a FAFSA at fafsa.gov or fafsa.ed.gov. This is a snapshot of the home page. Note that there is an option to fill out a paper FAFSA. And so if there's somebody who, for whatever reason, cannot do the FAFSA on the web, there is an option to submit a paper FAFSA, and you'll see the arrow there. There are 3 options to file a FAFSA. Online is one. There's a PDF again, and for some folks, they can actually call and complete a FAFSA by phone. This screenshot is from the 17-18 FAFSA because the 18-19 is not out there yet. FSA IDs are a key piece, and so for any student to be able to successfully file a FAFSA, they have to have had an FSA ID. The website to obtain it is there on your screen, fsaid.ed.gov. Basically, this process has 3 main steps. One important thing to note is that the student and the parent will each need their individual FSA IDs. And so basically they're going to, step 1 is enter login information, step 2, enter personal information, and then step 3, you have your mailing address, your contact information. And then last but not least, we tell folks don't forget to submit it because all of that work is for naught if they don't hit the submit button. It is recommended that these FSA IDs be requested and set up before submitting the FAFSA. Parents and students really should create their own FSA ID, and so in doing that, the different email addresses have to be used, and so parents and students can't use the same email address. The parent only has to have one FSA ID. If they have multiple children, each child needs their own. Sometimes if a parent is trying to use the IRS data retrieval tool and it's not working, one of the things you can do is check to make sure they're using their parent FSA ID and not their students, because if they're trying to use their students, it probably won't work. And also, if someone is trying to figure out whether or not they already have an FSA ID, there are 2 ways that you can kind of get at that. One could be trying to log in through the Edit My FSA ID link. If a person is able to log in and see their FSA ID profile, then that means they have an FSA ID. Another way, if someone's unsure as to whether or not they have an FSA ID, is they can go to the Create an FSA ID login, or the button, the link. And if they, once they start to create it, they will be notified if an account already exists with that information. If that is the case, then they would then need to proceed with the process to look up the password and or username that's already associated with that FSA ID. So here's another screenshot of the FAFSA. Know that with just that, when you log in, you can start a FAFSA, you can continue a FAFSA. So you do have the ability to start it, save it, and come back. Folks can make corrections. They can add school codes. And so there's a number of things that are accessible with just that one FAFSA login. There are several customer service options, including a live chat help, a toll-free number, and an email. Again, completing the FAFSA electronically is the best way to have your students file that. And this is a screenshot of the customer service options. And so here are some of the frequent FAFSA errors. So when people make mistakes, it's usually in one or more of these categories. And so either they're transposing Social Security numbers. You will see students in which a parent may have gotten divorced. So the biological students parents may be divorced, but then one of them has gotten remarried, the one in which the student lives with. And probably one of the bigger mistakes is folks for not putting that step parents information on the FAFSA. And so that's a conversation, again, for more in-depth information. I'm sure this topic will be covered in greater detail at any of those counselor workshops. Sometimes folks get their household size and number in college wrong, but these are some of the common errors. So if you can encourage folks to pay attention specifically to these areas, that should cut down on delays. Here's a screenshot of the information once a student goes and adds all of their schools they want on the FAFSA. There's some comparative data that pops up, and so for all the schools that the student put on their FAFSA, they get a snapshot of the name of the school, the website, graduation rates, transfer rates, things of that nature. And then here's a screenshot of the sign and submit page, where students and parents will be entering their FSA ID numbers. And so again, just making sure that folks enter the appropriate information in the proper places. Typically this area here, this information will be pre-populated, and it's this area here where the FSA ID is going to go. This screenshot says PIN, but know that the PIN number has been put to bed and been replaced with FSA ID. This is a screenshot of what one might see if they elect to go back into their FAFSA and make some corrections. And so oftentimes there'll be this this little box with the I in it that says verify the mailing address. And so this is a way for FAFSA filers to kind of go back and revisit the information to make sure it's correct. So once the FAFSA has been filed, provided an email address has been provided, then the student should receive a student aid report. We encourage them to look this over because this is a summary of all of the information they've put, and it's a great way for them to catch any errors earlier. So if folks have estimated any type of information, they can go back and correct it, or they can contact the financial aid office, who will be happy to correct those things. Also, when students are going through this financial aid process, if they have to turn in any additional documentation, it's imperative that they complete it and mail in any of those forms. And then once they do those things, they should be in position to watch to receive the financial aid award letters and packages from their respective colleges and universities. Very important to avoid errors is to encourage folks to read the forms and complete them carefully. Don't skip it. Don't make stuff up. Errors may very well delay their financial aid applications being processed and could result in the loss of financial aid funds. So please continue to reiterate that people be careful and complete these forms accurately as well as completely. If you need help in filing a FAFSA with a student and a family, there's the Federal Student Aid Information Center, and their 1-800 number is listed on your screen. The phone system is available 24/7, and agents are actually available Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning until 10 at night. If you find that you have a student or family that needs assistance with the FSA ID, there is a link on the screen for FSA ID, frequently asked questions, and then the phone number I saw out there was also the same as the Federal Student Aid Information Center phone number. College Goals Sunday, which used to be a statewide event to help students file the FAFSA, has been retired, and so the new program is FAFSA Help Ohio, and you see the website there, FAFSA Help Ohio, on the screen, and this will contain a calendar of FAFSA completion workshops. And so if you have students and families that want to work with an individual, they're more than welcome to do so. High schools can submit their event if it's open to the public. There are a number of sites available, and there are a bunch of resources. I checked it out yesterday to make sure it was still a good website, and it was. And so please jot that down to give to your students and families. From this website, the host sites can request volunteers, and so if anybody wants to volunteer to work at one of these types of events, you can get that information from the website. There's also resources, again, about the FAFSA and promoting your event. So if you're in charge of coordinating a FAFSA completion event, this might be a great place to advertise it. And there's also some links about how to complete the FAFSA. And so last but not least, we've reached the end of the presentation. I did good. I'm only 1 minute over. And so if you have any questions about anything contained in the presentation today, please feel free to contact us at any of that information. Again, as an OASFA member, we got to put a plug in here for the counselor workshops that are coming up. The registration is live, and so you still have time to do that. Also, if you are coordinating a high school financial aid night and you would like to have a presenter, you can request an OASFA volunteer to potentially present at your high school financial aid night. And last but not least, please sign up for our OASFA email database so that you get notified of upcoming events. And so with that, Mary, I'm going to toss it back over to you to see if we had any last questions and see if you want to add anything.
Erica, we didn't have any questions, and so the only thing I will add is, please, if any one of you has questions, you can email me or Erica directly, as well as the outreach email that's on the screen now, and we can respond directly to you. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. But otherwise, I think that Erica, you covered everything that we needed to, and the counselor workshops are a great opportunity to actually have interaction with a financial aid professional.
Thank you, Mary, and thank all of you for your time. Hopefully you found it to be beneficial. Have a great rest of your work day and a great weekend. Take care.